All right.
I hear a train. Is that our intro music?
That is our intro. All right, I think we're getting started here. I'm unable to see if folks are coming into the webinar, so I think I'll get us started. Welcome everyone to the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference. I'm Amy Basil. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm happy you are here for this breakout presentation, An Introduction to Disability Justice. I am a white woman in my 40s with long, straight, dark brown hair, wearing a green-blue heather sweater, and then sitting in my office with a gray cabinet and a painting of trees in a mountain and a plant behind me. We are providing live captioning CART services, which are available by clicking on the captioning icon. This presentation is also being recorded and will be available on our conference website soon. On behalf of the Planning Committee for the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference, I ask that you join me in acknowledging the land that we are on. The University of Wisconsin-Madison campus here is on the shores of Wunkshik-Homikala, or Lake Mendota, which resides within the sacred homeland of the Ho-Chunk people, a place they call Dejop, or Four Lakes. As the reach of the university extends to the far corners of our state, we also respectfully recognize the inherent sovereignty of the 12 First Nations of Wisconsin. So whether you're watching this from the land of these 12 First Nations, or you are more distant, we encourage you to learn about the history of the land that you are on. As social workers, we have a duty to look critically at the role our profession has played in the attempted cultural genocide and destruction of Indigenous families, such as was the aim of boarding schools in this state and across this continent. This conference is rooted in critical reflection on our work as social workers. Our goal is to bring clarity about the past, but also to challenge and inspire us all to move into this action in our work and communities once the conference is over. We hope this conference provides space for critical reflection, humility, and openness, which will allow us all to reflect, to hear and tell truths, and to move forward toward action and transformation to support Indigenous rights, cultural equity, and racial equity. With acknowledgement and gratitude, we move forward today in our journey. Before I introduce our speakers, a few Zoom info items. To access this presentation, you are required to provide your name and email, and this allows us to log our attendees and email you information on CEUs for this presentation, which will be distributed via email at a later date. Your cameras and microphones will remain muted during the presentation, but we do have a Q&A feature where you can submit questions or comments for our presenters who will see them, and we can then submit answers for those questions that you'll be able to see. And please know that due to the large volume of attendees, we may not be able to get to all the questions submitted. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our presenters. Patty Cisneros Prevo has always centered her work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. She was the Assistant Director of Inclusion and Engagement with Wisconsin Athletics, assisting in the development of the DEI strategic plan. And in her recent role as the Diversity and Equity and Inclusion Manager for the Wisconsin School of Business, Patty spearheaded all DEI initiatives in the undergraduate program. This year, she looks forward to her new role as Program Manager DEI with UW Health. Cisneros Prevo is contracted with Lee and Low Books and will have her first picture book published in spring 2023. Tenacious, 15 Adventures Alongside Disabled Athletes focuses on 15 disabled individuals and their major life and athletic accomplishments. In January 2021, Patty was also appointed to the Congressional Commission on the State of the U.S. Olympics and Paralympics. Three-time Paralympian, Cisneros Prevo was captain of the 2008 Paralympic team and led Team USA to its second consecutive gold medal after winning gold in 2004. Mari Magler is the director of the McBurney Disability Resource Center at UW-Madison. She has worked in the field of disability and disability advocacy since 1994 and in higher education since 2005. Magler is passionate about disability justice, access, and inclusion. She earned her Juris Doctor from Hamline University School of Law and her bachelor's in linguistics from Metropolitan State University. She co-authored The Mentor's Companion, a practical guide to mentoring, and a plan for mentorship of educational entrepreneurs in Minnesota. Patty and Mari, welcome, and I look forward to our time together. I'll now turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Amy. And if you don't mind going ahead and starting to share the slides, that would be great. We want to just say welcome, everyone. We're so excited to be here joining you all in this space for this conference. I know Patty and I were both very excited and just really enjoyed and learned a lot from Sammy and Leah's keynote this afternoon as well. So you will notice some overlap for sure, where we'll be talking about the 10 principles in our program, but also some other information as well. And we're just eager to get going. So give me 1 second, sorry, to adjust my screens here a little bit. And we will go ahead and get started here. If you want to go ahead to the next slide, please. And you can go ahead to the next one as well. Thanks. Before we get started with our introductions, I did just want to acknowledge and invite everyone to please take care of yourself in this session. So as I mentioned, we're very excited to spend this time with you. We're both excited to talk about disability justice for the next hour and a half, but also want to just invite you to do what you need to do to be comfortable in the space that we're in, wherever that is for you. So move around, disengage if you need to, take a break, come back if you can. But either way, we're glad to have you in whatever way you can be present. We also recognize that the online format is more accessible for some folks and less accessible for others. We will do our best to make the content that we're sharing and talking about today accessible. One of the ways that we'll do that is just to make sure that everything that's visual and text-based will be read aloud. And we will, I think, go ahead and dive in. So Patty, you want to go ahead and start?
Yes, happy Friday, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We know that it's 2 o'clock on a Friday, so thank you for your time. It's nice and snowy outside, so hopefully you can just get cozy and dive in deep with our presentation on Disability Justice 101. Like Mari said, my name is Patty Cisneros Prevo. I use pronouns she, her, and ella. And I am the new UW Health Program Manager for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I started like 10 days ago, so fairly new. With a quick visual description, I'm a brown Mexican woman. I'm wearing a bright yellow shirt and this really furry suede vest. I have long, dangly brown earrings that are shaped like leaves. I have a high ponytail today because I wanted to mix things up, and I wear black rim glasses. I also want to share a little bit about my disability because disability justice is so central to me. The movement resonates with me through and through the principles that you'll learn about a little bit more later. Want to give you some background on my disability. So I acquired a spinal cord injury almost 27 years ago. I was involved in a car accident as a freshman at Indiana University, and it really changed the trajectory of my life. I had been non-disabled for 18 years, and then all of a sudden I was forced to take on this identity that I had no knowledge about, no experience with. And so you can imagine it was pretty traumatic. I got involved in wheelchair basketball fairly soon after my injury, which really, you know, to not be cheesy, but to be cheesy, saved my life. But as a disabled athlete, and then eventually as an elite athlete competing on Team USA and at the Paralympic Games, I realized that I had internalized a lot of ableism. I didn't even know what ableism was at the time, but operating through the medical model of disability, which I'm sure you all as social workers know, really puts the burden on the disabled individual. And so really internalizing a lot of ableist language, ableist culture. And so you don't know what you don't know. And as a DEI professional, I learned more about this oppressive system of ableism. And then I was like, oh, shoot, I need to do something about it because I have perpetuated it, especially as a disabled person throughout my years of having a spinal cord injury. So this subject matter is very personal to me. And I hope that you will engage in the learning to really help dismantle this oppressive system of ableism.
Thanks, Patty. I'll go ahead. This is Mari speaking and do my introduction. I also just want to acknowledge that we're having some challenges with who is being presented. And so I'm not sure if it's quite figured out yet, but folks are working on it if not. I will go ahead and start with my visual description. This is Mari Magler again talking. I am a white woman. I have this kind of silvery chin length hair. I'm wearing today a blue top with a gray sweater and also a chunky black and silver leaf necklace, which Patty, we didn't talk about our leaf theme apparently we have going today. So pretty exciting. It means probably we've worked together long enough that is just happening. So I'm also going to share a little bit about myself and my identity and my relationship with disability. So I identify as a disabled individual as well. Primarily, I would say mental illness is kind of what is top of the list for me. So I've lived with mental illness pretty much as long as I can remember. Going back to now, looking back, kind of older elementary age is when it really started showing up for me. As I moved into junior high, high school, early college, I would say addiction became paramount and definitely took front and center. I was overusing substances, so drugs and alcohol, to a scary extent, and eventually put myself through a treatment program as a sophomore in my undergrad program. I tried to kind of stay clean, stay sober for the summer and go back to school the following fall, and realized very quickly that I did not know how to be in that environment still and take care of myself. And so I dropped out of school. I'm happy to report I quickly found a program that I loved. I had learned a couple languages in my younger years, and so I found a program to learn American Sign Language and then went to school to be a sign language interpreter. So that was kind of my first profession as an adult. So anyway, that's a little bit about my earlier years. As an adult, also generalized anxiety has set in for me as well. I'm also a person that lives with migraines regularly and sleep issues. I always say issues. I can't figure out a good way to talk about sleep trouble. So that's a little bit about me as well. And we're excited to spend the time with you. So Patty, I'll kick it back over to you. If Amy, you would kick us to the next slide.
All right, hopefully you can see me. I know that you may have missed my intro. I also failed to say that I'm a wheelchair user. So as I acquired my spinal cord injury, I am now a wheelchair user. So we want to kind of get our feet wet and talk a little bit about disability justice and what baseline knowledge you come with today. So what are some words that come to mind when you think of the words or the phrase disability justice. And we're going to try something new since we don't have the chat function. Go ahead and throw it in the Q&A because Mari and I do have access to that. So type in what you think of when you hear the words disability justice, and we'll read what we see on the screen. So we see equal access, badass. Yes, I like that one. Ableism, disruptor, advocacy, including everyone, accessibility, physically to areas, to jobs, intersectionality. Thank you, Kara. Equity, universal design, advocacy again, righteousness. Yes, I'm feeling super empowered. Dismantling systems, about time. Thank you, Joy. Yes. Innovation, liberation, grassroots, freedom, equality for everyone. Finally, here, Katie. Dismantling ableism, fighters. Yes, thank you so much for engaging in that Q&A. We didn't know how that was going to go, so thank you. It seems like it's going to work really well. All right, next slide.
So I think we got to go back a few slides, Amy, if you don't. There we go. We just have a couple of more questions and we appreciate your help, Amy. Don't worry, it's all good. We have a couple of questions for you all as audience members, again, just to get us started and to help Patty and I know kind of who's in attendance with us today. We should be able to populate these as poll questions. So as soon as the poll is activated, which it is now, you should have a pop-up. I'm going to also read aloud the poll questions and answers. And if for some reason the poll itself is not accessible to you, feel free to throw your responses also in that Q&A as well. So the question number one is, do you currently work in? And then the choices are higher ed, K-12, counseling, social work profession, or other. So just like to know a little bit about where you are coming from in terms of work, if you're currently engaged in any of those. And we'll just give a minute for folks to respond.
And again, if you can't access that poll, you can throw it into the Q&A because we can read those responses out loud.
Definitely. And I'm not able to see when people are done filling out the poll. So if it looks like we've gotten good completion, David, can I have you go ahead and just share the results of the poll? So I'm going to just share with you all what the results are. So we have about 16 people working in higher ed. That's about 11% of the audience today. Nobody responded yes to K-12. About 13 folks in counseling, 93 in social work professions, and then 25 people in something else in other. So let's go ahead and go to the next poll question. If you can forward the slide and go ahead and activate that next question. This question is, how would you rate your familiarity with disability justice principles? And here the choices are very little, some, average, above average, and expert. So again, we'll just give you a few seconds to respond to that question.
And thank you, Paul and Ryan, for engaging in the Q&A as well. Again, if you can't access the poll, we are reading answers from the Q&A section.
Perfect. And I'll ask David to go ahead and publish that poll when it looks like people are done. Thanks for that. So we've got a mix as expected. We have about 30% of folks saying that they feel like they know very little about disability justice principles, about 33% some, 25% average, and then 9% above average and 1% expert. So a nice range. As an introductory session, we definitely will be talking through those 10 principles of disability justice a little bit later in our session, which I feel like is really great repetition if you were able to attend the keynote. They did a great job talking through the principles as well. But we'll go through some other content in our time today as well. So thanks for answering those questions. And we'll go ahead and talk about a little bit more about what we're going to talk about in our session today next.
All right, some key objectives that we will be focusing on, and I'm just going to read from the slide. Number 1, review historical context of disability in the US. Number 2, discover key moments in disability justice activism. The next one, explore the 10 principles of disability justice, identify ableist language and microaggressions. And lastly, we are going to really challenge you to reflect on ways to disrupt ableism to affect change.
Thanks, Patty. Next slide, I just want to make a couple comments about language and about the content that we're going to be talking about today. So the first one is just to acknowledge that we will be talking about some terminology as well as reviewing some key points in history, as Patty mentioned, and in that can come up ableist and derogatory language. So know that that's coming, and again, really please do what you need to do to take care of yourself in this space, for sure, because this is not, some of the history especially is not easy to look at. The next couple items on the slide are person first and identity first. And so we just wanted to note that we are using a mix of person first and identity first language throughout our presentation. We do this intentionally. We feel that both of those terms are appropriate. We think that most people are probably familiar with these, but also understand that person first language may be very embedded still in educational programs. So think about social work program. I don't know what is being taught, if person first language is really centered still, or if we're starting to move beyond that. Briefly, person first language is where you start basically with person. So person with a disability, person who uses a wheelchair are examples of that. And identity first language is disabled person, wheelchair user. The idea behind person first language initially, I think, was that it was thought to be more respectful, which I kind of read as, because we don't want to lead with disability, because disability, we shouldn't talk about it, right? And so this shift to identity first language is like, nope, it's not only okay, but it's an essential part of who I am as a person, and I want to lead with that. So I say all of that, and I also think that it's important for us to recognize that culture, upbringing, personal growth and development, I could really relate to when Sammy talked about her own just growth and development in relation to that identity, that disability part of identity can really play an important role in the language that we use. So what we're here to do is to tell you that there's a mix. We come from a perspective where we think both are fine, and each individual gets to decide for themselves what kind of language that they use. So please just keep that in mind. We can go ahead to the next slide. We're going to switch now into some of the history of disability and look at some key moments and context. You can go ahead one more, Amy. Thank you. So this slide has a lot of text on it, and I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about each of these topics. The first one is education. And so I think about how disability shows up related to education over the history of the United States. For example, we see some glimmers of progress back in the 1800s, which seems like a long time ago, right? But we see at that time the establishment of schools for the deaf, schools for the blind. So we've got Gallaudet, being established, then the American School for the Deaf, the New England Asylum for the Blind, which became the Perkins School, which is around, certainly. Those are all institutions, higher ed institutions and K-12 institutions that were developed in the 1800s, and I think of those as glimmers of hope, and then quickly have to remind myself that the reason they needed to be established in the first place is because disabled students were often being excluded, specifically excluded from educational opportunities, right? There was legislation even that upheld the exclusion of or expulsion of students for just poor academic performance. So in my mind, right, I can easily connect that with potential disability. There's a Supreme Court ruling that upheld the exclusion of a child with cerebral palsy. So those things are happening, and there's some good movements happening as well, right? So that's a little bit about some of the educational things we saw or we experienced. Institutionalization and eugenics are the next pieces of my slide. And here's where we've got a lot of just problematic history. It's not the only place, but as early as 1752, we have a newly opened hospital in Pennsylvania that provides rooms in the basement, fully equipped with shackles attached to the walls. I can't say that that was the beginning of institutionalization as a movement, as an approach to treatment, quote unquote, but certainly one of the more public formalizing steps that occurred. We also, as we talk about institutionalization, I just want to take a minute to share a personal story about that my family experienced. So I was adopted. My parents I have an older brother who is also adopted. And before either of us were in the picture, my parents had a little girl that was placed with them named Christy. And they received her as a baby, and they had her for almost 18 months. Not formally being adopted yet, but working through the foster system. And my mom, when she tells this story, and my mom's now 86, I think, when she tells the story today, she's still like, you can feel the rawness of the emotion. What happened with Christy is that as they had her, and she was missing some of the milestones that were noticed by them and by medical professionals, and she was diagnosed with cerebral palsy. At that time, this would have been the 60s, the social worker involved and the state decided that they could not keep her. So they had no choice in the matter. Christy was taken from them and placed in, I will say, an institution, group home situation. And my mom talks about going to visit once after they were separated, and the social worker really just encouraging them to not come back because it would be too hard. And that story, it breaks my heart. And I also think it's an important one. It's a fitting one to think about how the profession and how just the United States, where we are, I think back the 60s is not that long ago, right? So we've come a long way, and there's lots more to go. So moving on from institutionalization, I think is also important to talk about eugenics. And so we saw some of the first eugenics laws in the early 1900s. Indiana became the first state to pass compulsory sterilization laws. We had other states in the US follow suit quickly. And we know that between 1907 and 1963, over 64,000 people were involuntarily sterilized under US eugenic legislation. You may be aware, if you're connected with UW-Madison, that one of our past presidents has a strong tie to the eugenics movement, Charles Van Hise, who was UW-Madison president from 1903 to 1918. And a very strong proponent of the eugenics movement. And I think about that sometimes and think about what influence he had over the campus and our programs and our education, and what are the lingering and lasting effects of that. The genetics department has done a really nice job, I think, they've got really good information on their website that talks about the history of eugenics as it relates to the genetics department and program. Really worth checking out if you haven't seen it. Moving on, the next item on my slide is about legislation. So we know kind of the two big pieces of legislation that really impact us most often are the Section 5 of the VOC Rehab Act, as well as the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we're not going to talk a ton about those now, but they were groundbreaking pieces of legislation for sure. And they're also not kind of the end all be all, right? They didn't solve all the problems. They were pieces of civil rights legislation, and we still have things to do. The other it's legislative, the Olmstead Act, which is my next bullet under moving to the community. So this movement to deinstitutionalize people, right? Olmstead decision decided in 1999 was a key part of that movement. And so under Olmstead, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later too, but under Olmstead, the Supreme Court decides or recognizes that mental illness is a disability under the ADA and fully covered by the ADA. And it directs all agencies to make reasonable accommodations to move disabled people out of hospitals and into community-based treatment options whenever possible. Throughout all of this, we have experienced many models of disability, thinking about how disability is framed over the years in many ways. A few that I've mentioned on the slide, and there are certainly more out there, are the charity model, which is the idea that disabled people need pity and charity. The medical model, I would say, is prominent still for sure today. Still very, very ingrained, definitely ingrained even in the work that we do in the McBurney Center for sure, right? That like, are you eligible? Do you have a disability? And then we move to the accommodations process, which is all retroactive. It's all medical model based. Social model is what we try to incorporate to the work that we do. But the social model kind of switches that focus from the medical model looking at disability as residing within an individual. So it's something about me that needs to be fixed, treated, cured. Social model takes the focus away from me and looks at the environment instead. And so we can think more creatively about things that we're doing, spaces we're building, creating, how I set my office up, how I approach my work, and am I doing it in a way that's accessible and inclusive for all folks to join me? And then the identity model is another that takes that social model perspective and goes a little bit further with disability as critical piece of identity, as well as disability as community. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Gonna take, and the next one too, a couple transition slides in here. We're gonna look now, or talk, excuse me, a little bit now about some of the early activism in the US and some of the focus. So we know that the focus is independent living movement that happened and is still happening. A lot of the focus when this started was on self-determination, thinking about, again, deinstitutionalizing, looking more at community living, and also removing societal barriers. And then we also looked at architectural barriers, employment and transportation barriers, and we started to have more legislation being passed to address some of those barriers. You can go ahead to the next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to talk now through some of the cool early activists that we have learned about. The first photo here is, it shows two individuals in the photo. It's a black and white photo. In the center is a black man wearing a suit and holding a microphone in a wheelchair, and this is Bradley Lomax. And then on the right, and almost cut off, but not quite, is a white woman with glasses on, kind of looking over her shoulder at Brad, and that's Judy Heumann, also in a wheelchair. Most people, I think, know Judy Heumann, very strong disability rights, activist over the years, instrumental in the 504 sit-ins, which included occupation of a federal building for something like 26 days or so. Bradley Lomax might be lesser known but very involved. And so Brad had a tie to the Black Panthers and was instrumental in connecting with the Black Panthers, who provided a lot of support to the protest to sustain them for 26-ish days. That was a long time for folks to be there. So meals and other support. The next slide, we have, again, 2 black and white photos. The photo on the left is a picture of a white man with a beard, it appears to be seated in a taller wheelchair. This is Ed Roberts. And there's a person in the background visible in the photo that's holding a sign. The words "for disabled" are the only ones that are visible on the sign, excuse me. So Ed Roberts, known as father of the independent living movement. Ed attended UC Berkeley back in the day and needed to live in a hospital ward rather than a dorm because he used an iron lung and there was no space for that kind of a thing in the dorms. So his attendance at the school really opened up the possibilities for other disabled students, more disabled students, and they kind of living together became known as the Rolling Quads. The photo on the right shows 2 Black men. I don't know who the individual on the right is, but the person on the left is Dennis Billups, and he is wearing kind of a plaid shirt with shaded glasses. He is blind, and he is another key player in the 504 sit-ins. And I can just recognize for myself, right, as I first learned about the 504 sit-ins back in the day, I did not learn about any of the people of color that were involved in the sit-ins. And so we've really tried to be intentional about, we know that they were there, we know they were involved. And so sharing some of them, just little pieces of that with you today. So Dennis is really interesting because he is a person who wasn't really planning to go to the protests when they started. His twin sister encouraged him to go and said, like, just go, they need your loud voice. And so he shows up. Eventually, he is a person kind of who becomes a spiritual leader or chief morale officer of the sit-ins, chanting, singing, leading efforts to really keep people together. And if we can go ahead to the last slide for me on this section. 2 more black and white photos. I wanted to pull some social workers in specifically for this conference, right? I will acknowledge it was really hard for me to find activists that included disability specifically, whether talking about being disabled themselves or just even focusing on disability rights. I struggled a little bit. We've got 2 photos. The one on the left is Jane Addams. This is a white woman. She's dressed in a full coat and hat. She's standing over a banner that reads something about women's votes. And you probably, if you know anything about social work in the history, you probably know about Jane Addams. I think she's often thought of as the mother of social work, well known for the establishment of one of the first settlement houses in the United States. Also, she had Pott's disease, which affected her spine. She had several spinal surgeries. I was interested to see how she was written about, where there was reference to Pott's, there was reference to spinal surgeries, and also reference to a mental breakdown, but no kind of tying any of that information to disability, which I found interesting. Another thing, as we think about the theme of this conference in general, I think it's really important to recognize that while Jane worked for racial equality throughout her life, she also lived in a world of white supremacy that influenced her work. So while she blamed white people's racism for the violent punishments taken out against Black men, she also erroneously assumed that those Black men were guilty of committing the crimes that they were accused of. It just shouldn't be their fault, which is very, very stereotypical based, right? So context is important. I think it's important to recognize that, not to undo all of the good work that she did, but certainly just to recognize that that's part of the story and part of the history. The photo on the right, and I will try to wrap up my part here, is also another black and white photo. This is a Black woman seated at a table wearing what appears to be a dress. You can only see her from the waist up. She's got kind of a sparkly necklace and a flowery hat on, and this is Dorothy Height. Obama, you might have heard this, right? Obama called Dorothy the godmother of the civil rights movement. And her early work was as a caseworker in New York City. And then she worked to fight racism, to fight sexism. She worked on reproductive rights, just to name a few things she was involved in. And I think she's also a good example of, or I shouldn't say it that way, she's a good example of experiencing sexism, right? I think we can learn from her experiences at the time, where you see her in many photos with Martin Luther King Jr., for example. She was present at the March on Washington and visible on the stage or at the podium, but not allowed the mic. So how all of these things tie together, I feel like fits very much into the principles, which we'll dig into a little bit later. But for this part, I'm going to turn it over to Patty as we start thinking more about disability justice and activism.
Yes, thank you, Mari. We're going to build off of that disability rights movement and the historical context of disability, and really focus on the disability justice movement, which centers the intersection of disability and other identities. So if you caught the keynote, Leah and Dr. Schock both talked about what disability justice is. And reading from the slide, in 2005, disabled queer people of color, Patty Berne there on the left, she's a person of color. She has long, curly brown hair, and she's looking over her left shoulder. And Mia Mingus, who is another person of color on the right of the slide, long, wavy brown hair, and here she has a gray t-shirt and glasses. They both sort of launched the framework of for disability justice, for the disability justice movement. I also want to note that they were later joined by Leroy Moore, Stacy Milburn, Eli Clare, and Sebastian Margaret in really establishing this framework for what the disability justice movement would be. Next slide. Again, another duplicate slide, but this one's actually a good duplicate, is the definition of ableism. Again, like Dr. Schock and Leah shared, here's the working definition by Talila T.L. Lewis. Talila is pictured here on the bottom right-hand corner. Talila is a person of color, a Black person. Here, Talila is wearing a white collared shirt with a blazer and has glasses. In this definition, and I'll read it, and I just encourage you to kind of lean in. It's a bit of a hardy definition, and for someone who is disabled and has been doing this work for a couple of years, this definition is a lot to process. So, a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, which Mari touched on earlier, anti-Blackness, which our keynotes talked about that, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This systemic oppression leads to people and society determining people's value based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth, or living place, health/wellness, and or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. And the last sentence is really key. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. And so again, it's a pretty hardy definition. And if this is your first time sort of experiencing the definition of ableism, I want you all to sort of engage in the Q&A section again. What's coming up for you? What is something new that you are learning through this definition? What is something maybe you already knew from this definition? Is there anything that you can tie back to the keynote about this definition? And again, we're going to use the Q&A function as our chat function, and Mari and I will both be able to look into that. So go ahead and fill in your responses if you feel comfortable. So. I love the last sentence because this affects everyone. Absolutely. That was kind of an aha when I first saw this working definition of ableism. Ability to behave in quotes. Yes, I think Dr. Shaw called them scary quotes. I don't remember what she said. How prevalent it is. Yes, I'm learning how much more I have to learn. You and me both, Cindy. Productivity is a scam and ableist, yes. Ageism and ableism go hand in hand, yes, thank you. Ableism hurts community, yep. Great, very grateful to see that the root of ableism is included with this definition, powerful. How it relates to capitalism and how it creates disability, as the speaker in the keynote mentioned. Your worth is determined by something or someone else or system. Yes, absolutely. This is all new info for me. Awesome. I'm glad you're here. The relationship between racism and ableism. Yes. Ibram Kendi has a wonderful podcast. I'm going off script now, Mari. Just give me 1 second. With Rebecca Coakley, who worked under the Obama administration, and they have a podcast about ableism and racism, the roots from the same tree, or something along those lines. Highly recommend that you take a listen to that if you are able. All right, next slide. Moving forward, again, similar to the keynote, we really want to feature Patty Berne. Here is a quote from her that really talks about the intersectionality of the disability justice movement. So disability justice was built because the disability rights movement and disability studies do not inherently centralize the needs and experiences of folks experiencing intersectional oppression, such as disabled people of color, immigrants with disabilities, queers with disabilities, trans and gender non-conforming people with disabilities who are houseless, people with disabilities who are incarcerated, people with disabilities who have had their ancestral lands stolen, amongst others. Next slide. And so the disability justice movement really hones in on intersectionality. And the concept of intersectionality describes the way in which these systems of oppression based on disability, gender, race, ethnicity, and other identities intersect or create compounded systems of discrimination and or disadvantage. And intersectionality was a term coined by UW-Madison graduate, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. And she really looked at the intersections of race and gender when she looked at how Black women were being discriminated against. And so she was, sort of dissecting it like, are these women being discriminated against because they are Black and they're faced with racism, or are they being discriminated against because they are women and so being faced with sexism, or is it both? And this term really resonates with me as a wheelchair user, disabled person, and as a brown Mexican woman, because often the intersection of my ethnicity and disability show up in all spaces. I can't show up in a space and only be disabled, just like I can't show up in a space and only be Mexican. The intersection of ethnicity and disability is always present. Next slide. And again, a little bit of repeat, but this is good. And it shows that I'm along the same lines as Dr. Shock and Leah, which makes me feel good. A little bit about Sins Invalid. So Sins Invalid is a disability justice-based performance project that incubates and celebrates artists with disabilities, centralizing artists of color and LGBTQ/gender variant artists as communities who have been historically marginalized. That's their mission. And it's important to mention Sins Invalid because they began out of UC Berkeley, like a lot of social justice movements. And this project really helped launch the 10 principles of disability justice, and all those individuals that I mentioned, Patty Berne, Stacy Milburn, Minga Mingus, to name a few, all were a part or participated in Sins Invalid. Next slide, and we're going to switch gears again and turn it over to Mari.
Thank you. We're gonna mix things up a little bit with our order today and switch gears and talk about some of the problematic language that I referred to earlier, and kind of dig into some problematic language, as well as we're going to spend some time talking through microaggressions that disabled people often experience. So next slide, please. So this slide that is visible or being shared right now is kind of a grid that shows 5, 10, 15 different terms. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read through all of these terms briefly now, but what we'd really like to do, instead of talking necessarily about every single one, is we'd like to know from you which ones would you like us to talk about. So let me first read through them all, and then I'll pose that question again for you. Along the first row, we have disabled, and I'm just going to point out the spelling is all lowercase except for a capital A. So disabled, but a focus on the A in abled. The next one is differently abled, physically challenged, special needs, and handicapped. On the next line, we have wheelchair bound. I'm not going to read the next word, but it is the R word. We have then lame, deaf and dumb, turn a blind eye to, and on the final row, we have, in quotes, use your voice, psycho, insane, crazy, and the last one is a quote, I'm so ... and you can fill that in with, I'm so ADHD, I'm so OCD, kind of whichever term you I don't want to say want, but any of those terms that you maybe have come across. And I'm going to take a second and I'm going to take a deep breath in and out. I should have said before I started reading all of these terms, like this is a good chance to just remind ourselves, myself included, that these are hard words. I didn't enjoy reading them all out loud. And I should have done a better job of saying, like, we're gonna talk about this more now. So thanks for bearing with me. Again, take care of yourself. If you need to just step away, that's okay. What we'd like to do here, though, is really talk about the ones that you'd like to talk about. So if you have questions about any of them, please let us know in the Q&A, but also let us know which of these terms poke at you, which ones cause certain feelings to rise up to the top. Which ones might you be unfamiliar with or unsure about? So please share some info with us in the Q&A. And I'm just gonna get situated here to, we're happy to talk more about any of the terms on this grid. Just want some direction from you all on which ones.
Oh, Mari, I already see differently able, so I'm gonna jump in here. So the first four on that top line, disabled with the capital A, differently abled, physically challenged, and special needs are all euphemisms. They're all trying to get around the word disability or disabled. And we really want to reclaim that word of disability. I guess not reclaim because it's not an old word, but we want to say it. You know, there's a popular hashtag started by a disabled individual hashtag say the word. And disabled, disability are not bad words, and we really want to encourage you to use the word disability. I will be the first to say, oh my gosh, it's kind of cringy now that I think about it, but I did use these words. I did use, oh, I'm differently abled and I'm physically challenged or disabled with a capital A. And as I've engaged in the work, I realized that just perpetuating this notion that disability and disabled are wrong, are bad, instead of just using the words disability and disabled and being proud of that identity.
Thanks, Patty. There's lots of things populating in the Q&A. Thanks everybody for throwing ideas in. I saw one, I'm not familiar with use your voice. So that's it's a good one. I think the use your voice is, I feel like, especially as we are in spaces where we're talking about activism and we want people to, use your voice, lend your support to whatever the cause is that we're talking about. The way that we frame that, using your voice, kind of focuses or centers the idea that everyone communicates in the same way. And so we just want to acknowledge that some folks use American Sign Language. Some folks use smart communication devices or other ways of communicating, and those are just as valid. And so it can feel othering to use language that specifically focuses on one particular sense. And then, oh yeah, go ahead.
I want to jump back into the top 4 because I see that coming up a lot in the Q&A. Someone did say, I find language to be a challenging area. I do too. It's constantly evolving. And that you want to be respectful of the language people prefer. Absolutely. I think what Mari mentioned at the beginning, if someone identifies themselves and they're disabled and they identify as differently able, you have to respect that. Like, I can't tell someone like, oh, that's wrong. You can't do that, because if they're disabled and they have that identity, they have that right to identify any way they want. Even if they use the word handicap, I don't think that came up, and I hope that we are all on the same page that word is very outdated. But yes, it can be tricky. I actually did another presentation, and it was to a group of volunteers for an adaptive sport organization. And I had such pushback from this veteran who was disabled, and he wanted to use differently abled. And he just kept coming at me like, you can't say you're a disabled person. And I was like, here's the thing, you're disabled, I'm disabled, you can identify the way you want to, I can identify with the way I want to, and they're both right. And so thank you for including that in the chat.
Yeah, another person writes in, can we discuss disabled versus disability? For example, she has a disability versus she is disabled. And the question is it a similar concept to someone has an addiction, not that they are an addict? And I think that going back to kind of that person first, identity first discussion, again, it really can vary by the individual. So I identify as an addict, and I have identified because I am an addict, and that's the label that I've used. It's the part of me that has existed for a really long time. I'm super comfortable using that term to describe myself. And I don't think in my description I included my age, but I'm 50-ish. And so I think that people are talking about addiction in different ways now. And so I might meet someone who is newer to that identity that might talk about it in a very different way than I talk about it. And that's okay too. So I think even myself, I identify as disabled, and that can change for me depending on the day, depending on how I feel, depending on what environment or setting I'm in. I might say I'm a person with a disability. Sometimes I say that, and sometimes I'm super comfortable talking about being disabled. So I think I'm not sure spectrum is even the right word, right? But there's a give and take, there's movement and fluidity within that. And maybe we can pick just a couple more, Patty.
Yeah, Mari, I'm seeing crazy a lot, and we've talked about this. Do you want to mention the sort of the group that goes together?
Yeah, definitely. I think those terms, insane, psycho, and crazy, are terms that are really thrown around often very flippantly in society in contexts where that really isn't necessarily what people mean. For example, that meeting, we just left this meeting, it was so crazy, or gosh, I went to this thing last night, it was crazy, it was insane. And as a person who lives with mental illness, I would say just be cautious and cognizant of the fact that there are folks who have experienced those words being thrown at them, weaponized against them, yelled, thrown with hatred and judgment. And so to be then just kind of thrown around flippantly in casual conversation can feel a certain way. I think it's a good reminder to just think about the weight that those terms can really bring and have with them.
And maybe just two quick ones. I will do wheelchair bound really quickly. I saw that in the Q&A. So wheelchair bound, again, is an outdated word like handicap. I mean, there are, I think 10 years from now, there'll be words that we use that are outdated. Language evolves just like culture and people. And so to those who wanted to have a little bit more about why they're outdated, it's just language is constantly changing. So we don't use handicap. Accessible is a preferred word. So like an accessible parking spot, an accessible bathroom stall. Wheelchair bound is, again, one of those problematic ableist terms that came out of the medical model. I tell Mari this all the time. I went 20 plus years identifying myself as wheelchair bound. And then not until I knew, again, give yourself grace. You don't know what you don't know. When I was like, ooh, I'm not bound to my chair. I certainly, transfer onto my bed when I sleep, transfer onto the toilet, transfer onto the driver's seat when I drive. So not bound to my chair. I'm a wheelchair user. So I know that came up. And Mari, just because of your experience, you want to talk a little bit about special needs?
Sure. I think special needs is one of the terms that I always react a little bit, because I think that I see also special accommodations being sometimes used when, let us know if you need special accommodations, and there's not anything special, right? So I think that terminology, special needs anyway, is a little bit more common or present still with parents of children who have disabilities. And I can't, I think that again has to be an individual choice. But when I talk about needs, my own needs to attend something, to participate in something, they aren't special. They're the basic needs that provide me access, the same access as everybody else has to attend and participate. So just getting rid of that special piece of it, for me, is what's important there. So why don't we switch gears? There's so much, we could spend so much time talking more about language. And I think folks have also let us know there are terms missing. Absolutely, there are terms missing. There's so much more here. So thanks for participating in that. We're gonna talk next about microaggressions, which is another category that we could spend just hours and hours talking about. We're gonna try to move through this in about 10 minutes if we can. We have a list of 12 microaggressions that were identified and named in 2010 by Keller and Galgay. There's also, if you Google microaggressions and disability, you'll come up with lots of examples. I think many follow these themes, but we're gonna go ahead and cover 12 today. And the first slide that we're showing has 6, and we'll go in order. So the first one is denial of privacy. And this microaggression, basically an individual's right to privacy is ignored because they have a disability. And I say they here, I'm thinking more about folks with apparent disabilities, I think, experience this more. Although I say that, and I know that students here at UW-Madison even, we hear about really awkward conversations with instructors sometimes where they're being asked questions that shouldn't be asked, right? So, but if I think about someone with an apparent disability getting questions like, what's wrong with you? What happened to you? Those are really clear examples of that first one. The second one is secondary gain. And with this, the aggressor wants to receive recognition or praise for doing something good. And it could just be providing an accommodation that was requested. Oh, look, I set this up for you. And being all excited and wanting praise and, you know, that pat on the back for doing it, rather than thinking about like whatever it is I did just like I did, like I made my thing available for all people. That's just a part of it. And I shouldn't look for that or need that praise specifically.
And I'll continue on. Hopefully, you know, I wanted to say that we all have some experience or baseline knowledge of microaggressions. And so Mari and I are really talking about disability specific microaggressions. There's microaggressions, you know, racist microaggressions and sexist microaggressions and all that, but really honing in on these. And as a disabled person, wheelchair user, unfortunately, I have had experience with all of the ones that we will share with you. So hopefully in your roles as social work professionals that you will be mindful of these when you are working with individuals with disabilities. So the third one, perceived helplessness, is pretty clear cut. It's when someone is perceived to be helpless because of their disability. If, you know, I get this all the time because I'm in a wheelchair, I may have groceries on my lap, I may be trying to open a door, and all of a sudden someone rushes in to open that door or snatch groceries off my lap. Yes, that has happened. Someone almost tried to snatch one of my children off my lap once. Again, perceiving that because I have a disability, because I have an apparent disability, am helpless. And I know that Mari and I have talked about this extensively, like a lot of these microaggressions go hand in hand. You know, she talked about the secondary gain. And when we think about someone rushing to open the door for me, they're like, look what I did. I helped the wheelchair bound girl get through the door. So they often go hand in hand, and disabled individuals can experience multiple microaggressions. The next one, spiritual intervention. This one's my favorite, and I say that with the utmost sarcasm. This is when you try to pray away or provide some kind of spirituality around getting rid of someone's disability. They are perceiving you as there's something wrong and you need to be fixed, and the way to fix it is through spiritual intervention. I have been prayed over way more times than I want to count, in public, in the grocery store, at restaurants, with my children. And it's, again, a microaggression saying that something is wrong with you and we can fix it.
I also just want to acknowledge a few people are pointing out in the Q&A that there's nothing micro about these, and we agree. Yes, thank you. The next one on this first slide is denial of disability-related experience. And the idea behind this microaggression is that a person's personal experience with disability is trivialized. Things like "you seem fine," and I kind of talked earlier about some of, you know, what we hear from students in awkward conversations sometimes with instructors. And sometimes that's, "why do you need this accommodation? You seem fine, you look normal," things like that. That can not only be a denial of privacy, but also denial of disability related experience. You don't seem X enough to need whatever it is you're asking for. And I appreciate Leah in the keynote really talking or reinforcing that idea that disabled people are like, they're the best situated, we are the best situated to know what we need, right? And so to not be questioned, it would be great. The last one on this particular slide, the end of the first 6, is patronization, and this is false admiration for disabled people for doing anything simply just because they have a disability.
And I think we can go to the next slide and we'll engage in the chat after all 12. Does that sound
great?
Awesome. Second class citizen is the next on this list. So I am married. My partner, Tony, is not disabled. He is a non-disabled person. And oftentimes when we're together and I'm asking for accessibility needs or just regular access, many times the other person talks to my husband. They don't talk to me because they're seeing and viewing me as a second-class citizen because I'm in a wheelchair, I'm disabled, and he is a non-disabled individual. And I'm the one who's asking or requesting the accessibility, and so they should be directing that to me. But oftentimes that is the case, especially when I'm around non-disabled people, walking people, this happens often. Denial of personal identity. This is when you're hyper focused on disability. We see this a lot, you know, in news, like feel-good news stories on TV or in the newspaper, and oh, this person is so incredible, they have a disability, and oh, look what they did, they have a disability, and they've overcome everything, they have a disability, and they are not recognizing the whole person. And I know Dr. Schultz talked about one of the principles of disability justice is recognizing disabled individuals as whole people. And so with this microaggression, you're like hyper focused on just a disability and not recognizing that they could be a mother, they could be a daughter, they could, you know, have a different ethnicity, a different culture, a different religion, etc.
Nice. The next one is spread effect. And this is when this happens, it's someone making an assumption that because there's a disability in one particular functional area, so to speak, it leads to limitations in other areas. So for example, a deaf person going to a restaurant and being handed a Braille menu, right? People talking loudly to someone in a wheelchair, for example. And Patty has shared that she has experienced that.
It's unfortunate.
The next one is infantilization, and this is the idea, it's pretty self-explanatory, but the idea that a person with a disability is treated like a child, right? We forget that they have agency and that they're a person that they're being interacted with.
The last two, it's funny, not funny, but I share like my personal experiences. I was injured when I was 18, so very much in the prime of dating life, you know, clubs, bars, all of that. And so that second to last microaggression, desexualization, is when you see a disabled person and that they're incapable of being sexy or sexualized or anything like that because of their disability. And then the last one is almost like the opposite. Exoticism is where you know, again, hyper focus on the disability and you have this like fantasy and you create this sort of like, we call them devotees, like people that are very like fixated on the disability. And so, you know, you could imagine dating as a wheelchair user in my early 20s, being met with both of these microaggressions. And that last one, I had to block some people when I did some online dating because I was like, this is not what I want.
Yeah.
All right. Now that we've gone through these 12 quickly, and again, wanting to be mindful of time, what's coming up for you about these microaggressions? And again, we really want to stress that you don't know what you don't know. So if you have use these microaggressions, like we're not saying, oh, you're terrible, but now you know not to use them moving forward. But what has come up, what's new, what did you already know? Anything in the chat? And again, we're trying to read them quickly. I know that we've missed some questions and we'll try to answer some of the questions that are coming up within the engagement toward the end if we have time.
Yeah, and I'll just, you know, recognize one person put in the Q&A. So it's so important to update language and terms, as often microaggressions are out of a person's awareness and need to be reflected on and explained. Absolutely. I think that, you know, sometimes I think Patty and I and other folks here on campus have talked about many of the topics that we're talking about today in different ways, in different spaces. And sometimes I think, like, can we move on? And yes, we can, and we do, and we should. And also there's always a need for introductory information, right? As Patty said earlier, you don't know what you don't know until you know it. And we're all entering these conversations at different places. So thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah, and thanks, Allison, for the comment in the Q&A about, learning that micro and microaggressions doesn't mean small, it means one-on-one by an individual versus macro/systemic. So absolutely, yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Why don't we go ahead and jump into the principles, Patty, just to make sure we don't run out of time.
Absolutely. All right. So we wanted to end on a positive note. Ableist language could be heavy. Microaggressions can certainly be heavy. What can you do? So we're going to go through these 10 principles of disability justice. If you tuned into the keynote, they went through them as well. So hopefully this repetition is helpful. Number one, intersectionality. We talked a lot about this. And I'm going to read from the slide, the very experience of disability itself being shaped by race, gender, class, gender expression, historical moment, relationship to colonization, and more. And for someone who has multiple underrepresented identities that intersect, intersectionality really is what centers me with this movement. Number two, leadership of those most impacted. Leah talked about this in the keynote. Reading from the slide, to truly have liberation, we must be led by those who know the most about these systems and how they work. And so I don't know which one mentioned, like, yes, the white male who graduated from Harvard, who is a wheelchair user, he can certainly, be an advocate for disability, but those that have the intersection of race and gender and class and gender expression and disability know more about those other systemic those other oppressive systems like racism and sexism and ableism. And so their experiences and what they know, they should be leading the work toward liberation.
Next slide, please. The third principle is anti-capitalist politic. And on the slide here, in an economy that sees land and humans as components of profit, we are anti-capitalist by the nature of having non-conforming body minds. We talked earlier, also Sammy and Leah talked about how human worth is defined in the United States, especially, right? What is seen as worth and having worth and worthy. The next one is cross-movement solidarity. Here is shifting how social justice movements understand disability and contextualizing ableism. Disability justice lends itself to politics of alliance. So the idea that we are all in this together, so attending Benjamin Jealous keynote on Martin Luther King. So he did his presentation here on campus on the 23rd on Monday. And a theme I feel like that was throughout his presentation as well, as this idea that we can't, we're not going to end, and I think his example was, we're not going to end poverty for Black men if we don't address or end poverty for white men. We have to look at things systematically, and we really need to understand that all things are related. I love Leah, she said something in the keynote like we're all in the same ocean in overlapping boats, which stuck out. I thought that was a great way to think about it. We know that systems of oppression reinforce each other. And so we need to challenge as a white individual, I need to challenge notions of racism in the disabled community. We need to push other movements or groups of folks to think about ableism in the work that we do. We can go ahead to the next one, please.
All right, next one is recognizing wholeness. I love what Dr. Schock said about this, disabled people have many facets. They're, in reading from the slide, each person has an internal experience composed of thoughts, sensations, emotions, sexual fantasies, perceptions, and quirks. And we really have to recognize disabled people are whole people. Number 6, sustainability. Individuals learn to pace themselves individually and collectively to be sustained long-term. And this one really hits home for me. As someone with a spinal cord injury, I am very aware of the research around individuals with spinal cord injuries and that I will have a life expectancy 10 years less than someone who does not have a spinal cord injury. And so sustainability is very important and central to me in doing this work. And so really having that sort of permission to learn to pace myself when doing this work.
Moving ahead, number 7 is commitment to cross-disability solidarity. Again, this is honoring the insights and participation of all our community members, knowing that isolation undermines collective liberation. And again, from the keynotes, and keep stealing their lovely words, but they did such a great job of talking this through, thinking about that there are certain disability-related identities or disabled populations that tend to be more isolated than others, or could be othered more often than others, if that makes sense. And so we really need to be careful that we're including all folks in the conversations and in our actions and movements towards solidarity and towards, towards access and inclusion, right? And then I'm sorry, we're trying to move quickly, so I apologize. I feel like I'm speaking quickly and stumbling over my words a little bit here. Number 8 is interdependence, and this is meeting each other's needs as we build toward liberation, knowing that state solutions inevitably extend or mean further control over our lives. And this gets back to the idea of disabled people leading the efforts, but also disabled people understanding that it's okay to rely on each other and others to be community, to not feel like we have to be in things alone or on our own. And Patty, do you want to talk a little bit about this one?
Yeah, again, I keep mentioning the medical model of disability because I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that social workers and social work profession probably dives into that model. And as someone who acquired a disability late in life, I was always pushed toward being independent. To be successful, I needed to be independent. To live a successful life, a meaningful life as a disabled person, I had to be independent. And so this principle is really near and dear to me because it gives me permission to be like, you know what, I can't do it all the time. And it's okay to ask for help from others. Next slide, Amy, please. Mari and I have the worst time management. We're always running out of time, so I apologize if it sounds like we're talking really quickly. Number 9, collective access. We can share responsibility for our access needs. We can ask that our needs be met without compromising our integrity. And it's really important to understand that access needs aren't shameful. So as those who are in the work of social work and even working with children with disabilities or any disabled people, really helping them understand that access needs aren't shameful. I think there's a lot of internalized ableism about access, and we can do that collectively to encourage others to do it. I was telling Mari not too long ago that my time at Wisconsin School of Business was the first time that I had asked for accommodations. And I have been in a wheelchair for almost 27 years. And it was the first time that I ever asked a place of employment or education for access needs. Internalized ableism, absolutely. But being surrounded by this collective community really helped encourage me to ask for what I need. And lastly, collective liberation. I'm going to read from the slide and then Mari's going to wrap us up with a great quote. We move together as people with mixed abilities, multiracial, multigendered, mixed class, across the spectrum, sexual spectrum, with a vision that leaves no body, mind behind.
And so I'm going to read, I'm showing this, the cover of this book. It's the Skin, Tooth, and Bone book that I think Leah and Sammy shared a photo of earlier. Sins Invalid has made their materials very accessible as well. So if this is your first introduction to these principles, please check them out online. This book is a great resource, very affordable, and is available electronically as well. But this quote for Principle 10 really just jumped out to me and I loved it. So I'm going to share it with you all. It reads, disability justice is not yet a broad-based popular movement. Disability justice is a vision and practice of what is yet to be, a map that we create with our ancestors and our great-grandchildren onward, in the width and depth of our multiplicities and histories, a movement toward a world in which every body and mind is known as beautiful. And I thought that was a great way to kind of wrap up the conversation we were having about the principles. So I know we are really about out of time here. We've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about the historical context of disability. We've talked about some disability activism. We've gone through language and microaggressions and the 10 principles. What we really wanted to spend a little bit more time on with you all is doing some reflecting, but also sharing of ideas around ways to really disrupt ableism. So maybe just to go on to the next slide, Amy, just with a couple minutes, 60 seconds, given everything that we've talked about today, everything that you've learned from the keynote as well as what you might already know and bring to the table, what are some steps that you can take to actively promote and support disability justice? I would love to have people share thoughts and ideas in the Q&A.
And I know there was a question that was popping up by Shmuel about like how we would, sort of enforce disability justice principles in our work, Mari. And I think for me, having permission again to recognize my sustainability, really thinking about collective access and encouraging and being that advocate for other people who may need access. Also thinking about the interdependence. I mean, gosh, that's such a flip for me, but really reaching out to the disabled community and asking what I can do. How can I be an ally? How can I help? And so I know that in my work, these principles are they resonate with me so much as someone who has had a lot of internalized ableism and trying to dismantle that within myself.
And I think it's a good question, and it's one that I think a lot about, especially given my role on campus with the Disability Resource Center. And I definitely cringed when Leah said it's the accommodations offices where you go to get told no, right? I was like, and I can't say that that's not the experience for some individuals. Absolutely. I think we work really hard here at UW-Madison to do everything that we can to support students and their access needs for sure. And we are the whole system of accommodations and why they're provided and how they're provided, as I mentioned earlier, is based on this kind of medical model, legalistic model. So some of the things that I really think about are my own role. So talking about disability justice, pushing conversation about disability just so that it is a topic that's being talked about on campus. I will say that so excited to be working with the students that are working towards getting a disability cultural center going. It's actually the McBurney Disability Resource Center that is completely supporting those efforts right now with providing space. Just got furnished a couple weeks ago, and we're getting ready to launch sort of a soft opening for students. And this will be a space that students will be able to access. We have a team of interns hired that are students and we're just so excited to be supporting those efforts. So those are just a couple of pieces. And maybe a couple items from the Q&A. I know folks are sharing something. I will repeat the name of the book. It's called Skin, Tooth, and Bone. And you can, if you go to sinsandvalid.com, or is it .org.com, I think, you can find information about the 10 principles of disability justice, as well as information about this book.
All right. I think, I've been reading the Q&A. Thank you so much for engaging in that. It worked out way better than I thought. So thank you so much for participating. Hopefully you've learned, a thing or two to really take back and affect that change. So thank you, Amy. Thank you, participants. Mari, as always, OG.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to Chris, our captioner as well. And
Yes.
thanks everyone for joining us today.